Hi everyone, Alec Media welcomes you. This is the project backed by both Baku and Yerevan press clubs. We are talking with the experts from Armenia and Azerbaijan about their perception, foreign perception of their conflict. And today, Armenian conflictologist Arsen Kharatyan and independent researcher from Baku, Shujaat Ahmedzade, joined us. So I'm pleased to welcome them, and we're really grateful to both of them. Hi, Alex.
Hello.
Okay, our first question will be about comparison of Armenian-Azerbaijan conflict to the other ones. And as you may know, there are a lot of territorial conflicts in Eurasia and in post-Soviet area as well. But usually in Europe and in post-Soviet area, Western public opinion supports their country, not the self-proclaimed republic, but the country itself, which territory was violated, as international law says. Ukraine, Moldova, Georgia, or Cyprus. However, Karabakh seems to be a unique case where Western public opinion and maybe liberal intellectuals defend the right of people of self-determination on foreign territory. In your opinion, why happened like that? First of all, yes, Arsen, please start.
Okay. Thank you for having me, and I want to welcome this series of program by Yerevan Press Club and Baku Press Club. I remember in the 90s, after the first Karabakh War, there was a similar program called Telemost, and it was an original, one of the very few dialogue grounds for Armenians and Azerbaijanis to be able to speak with each other. Obviously, there was no internet, so it was all based on television, and Telekampanya Mir was basically in charge of it. So this sort of reminds me of those days when, right after the wartime, when it's, of course, the wounds are fresh, people begin to discuss with each other possible ways and routes for the future cohabitation and what can come out of the possible dialogues. I would dive into the depth of the conflict would probably require several hours to discuss. So I think many of our listeners or whoever is joining this dialogue now could learn a lot from the history through other programs. I think the goal of this program is to sort of see how divergent our views are in general, maybe, or how similar our views are maybe on several issues with regards to the current state of the Nagorno-Karabakh conflict. We are dealing with a very different situation from what we had, as we all know. Basically, we are talking at a time where pretty much no Armenian is left in Nagorno-Karabakh. As we all know, in September of this year, the exodus of the Armenians of Nagorno-Karabakh took place, and over 100,000 people moved to Armenia. And so we are talking about a very new status quo in the conflict. My personal view has been that a true Armenian-Azerbaijani dialogue would be much more effective if it went through Stepanakert and Baku, if we were able to have a dialogue between Armenians of Nagorno-Karabakh and Azerbaijanis in general. And I think it would create a better environment for the future of our coexistence. However, we have a very different situation right now, and unfortunately, my understanding is that we are continuing deepening hatred towards each other. And I think that, unfortunately, there is little to hope for when it comes to any serious resolution of the conflict. On the level of the societies, there has always been a dialogue, and Armenians and Azerbaijanis can get along in many, many different formats in different places, whether it's academic, whether it's journalists, whether it's just people who live outside of Armenia and Azerbaijan. However, the reality on the ground very much and heavily depends on the politics of the current administrations. I don't know, it's probably like a mirror reflection of what it used to be. If in the 90s, Armenia had the upper hand after the First War, and in some cases, not under the Petrosyan administration, but later on, was often acting arrogantly and thinking, or maximalist, had maximalist views. My feeling is that probably right now what we're seeing in our discussions with Azerbaijan, we are seeing that there is really not much interest in finding a long-term resolution, but rather keeping the new status quo. But this is something that can be discussed, and I'm sure our colleague from Azerbaijan will have a lot to say.
Some additional question to you. You talked a lot about Armenian perception, but we are talking about foreign perception most of all. And so I believe that, as you said, Armenia was so maximalist, maybe because they they thought this perception to be successful. Maybe they feel that it's okay for their public opinion, the Western public opinion, to support this self-determination in Nagorno-Karabakh. So why was it like this? Because even Armenian President Yerevan said that it will be not like this, but actually it happened. That a lot of, for example, Western politicians or American politicians, they supported the Nagorno-Karabakh Republic itself, and it was quite popular in Western media.
Well, very much depends on what politicians we're talking about. If we're talking about the Congress and the Senate of the United States, where we have the well-organized ethnic Armenian lobbying, we have seen consecutive statements, etc. But as you can see, and as we can see, when it comes to the executive body, whether it's the State Department or whether it's Quai d'Orsay in France, they have been very balanced, and they wouldn't take one or the other principle which was being discussed before the war of 2020. As we all know, and I'm sure our Azerbaijani colleague knows the negotiation process from the past, the idea was to sort of coincide or put together the principles of self-determination and territorial integrity, and that has been in the foundation of the negotiations. However, again, I want to go back to this. We are dealing with a very different situation now. If before we had some kind of a format or philosophy of negotiations, let's call it constructive ambiguity, where you have you're trying to discuss possible solutions in one format and nothing is decided unless everything is decided. Now we don't have basically any negotiations whatsoever. There is no new framework. There is no new process. We are discussing several different directions, issues of delimitation and demarcation, issues of mutual recognition, issues of right for return, etc., and so on. But again, we are dealing with a very, very different situation from what we had before.
Yeah. Let's turn to you, Shujaat. So I know that that's a really stressful issue for Baku. So what do you think? Why public opinion in Western Europe or in USA or just in Western media discourse were so pro-Armenian all this time, and Basically, do you agree that it was like this, maybe?
Thank you for the question. So I think I would first disagree with an argument saying that there was a pretty much interest, some sort of interest into the Armenian-Azerbaijani conflict among the Western audiences. I think the general premise that we should some sort of having a consensus on is that for most of the Western audiences, including the ones in Europe and in the United States and outside of the States, Canada and the others, there has always been a lack of knowledge on the Armenian-Azerbaijani conflict. So it is ignored, to put it mildly, be it the Azerbaijani suffering of the conflict, be it the Armenian suffering, because for the most of the Western societies, this conflict has never been a top priority in terms of discussing whether this is Armenian position or Azerbaijani position. So this is the first general, I think, the landscape that Armenians and Azerbaijanis have been operating for the past 30 plus years, is that there has been a, let's say, ignorance towards Armenians and Azerbaijanis in the West and in most parts of the world, surely. But since the most conflicts, the Armenian and Azerbaijani one also included, are complex in itself, the societies largely take this information, the complex information, and transform it into more of like a simple chunks so they can digest the whole complexity of the one conflict. So Armenian and Azerbaijani history and its conflict is quite complex. And I think one should not expect from Italians, French, British, and American and the Canadians to really digest every single aspect of this conflict that they never heard of. And I think most of Azerbaijanis would also mention how little known about Azerbaijan as an independent country, let's say until a decade, and so it was largely unknown place for many. So under these circumstances, there is a very individual, let's say, tendency to transform what is complex into what is quite, let's say, manageable, understandable chunk, what is quite, let's say, simple. And when you decode the complex understanding into something simple, you always come from certain ideological and cultural lenses, which shape your overall worldview, depending on how you look at the outside world. And of course, I would agree with you that in certain circles, in certain ideological settings, you had more pro-Armenian position heard than a pro-Azerbaijani position, and that would include, for example, some far right, some Christian fundamentalists, some white supremacists in Europe and in the United States, not because they cared about Armenian suffering, but largely because from their perspective, what is important is the supremacy of either Christianity or either the European white supremacy and so on. So from that perspective, the Armenian-Azerbaijani conflict was put into something religious lens, even though this conflict is not about religion at all. So that is the one perspective where you had some pro-Armenian voices being more visible. On the other hand, you had probably some neocons, conservatives, which found some sort of a strategic prize in Azerbaijan, given it is the only country borders Russia and Iran at the same time. So from their perspective, it would have made more sense if they support Azerbaijan in a conflict over Armenia, because the strategic prize of Azerbaijan as a geopolitical entity was much more than of Armenia. So that was also a dominant view among the neoconservatives and the, let's say, more realpolitik circles in the West, particularly in the United States. For most of the audience, the conflict was discovered in 2020, and you have to also look at the dynamics of the war in 2020. In 2020, Armenia was a defeated party, with resulting in a crushing defeat as a result of whole surrounding regions getting taken back by Azerbaijan, and also to 1/3 of Nagorno-Karabakh, including some Armenian populated parts of Nagorno-Karabakh, namely Hadrut, and some small chunks in the north, getting also controlled by Azerbaijan. So you have also Armenians living in mass from those areas, which also depicts the conflict in a way that it is the Armenian suffering, which is real, that happened. But also it gives a message to the audience that this is how conflict happens, which was not the case back in the, let's say, 90s, largely because of the ignorance. Then also you had a not widespread usage of social media and other media channels. So a lot of things are combined here. Of course, and this is a very complex situation. On the one hand, you have some people putting the conflict into Oriental framework, and just because there is some sort of targeted goal behind this, and some doing it just because they don't know the conflict at all, and some doing it for some political goals. So it is, and it's a very complex understanding, but I still would go back to my first point, that is, for most Western societies, including as of now, this conflict is not known in details, and it is largely ignored, with episodic entries coming and going, but largely it is not known and it is not cared about. That would be how it is perceived in the West.
Yeah, I absolutely agree about the ignorance, and I could say that it is quite the same in Russian society. It depends on your ethnicity. If you're Armenian or Azerbaijani in Russia, so it works. But if you're Russian, so most of people just don't care about it. But maybe let's talk about dynamics. Were there any dynamics of perception? Maybe in the early 90s, it was something different from what we have now. Maybe there were some moments when Armenia's or pro-Azerbaijani's vision was more popular in Europe or somewhere. What would you say, dear experts? How did it work for these 30 years? Was it the same or not? Please, Arsen, let's start.
Yeah, I will agree with the overall assessment that there has really not been much of an interest in the West with regards to the conflict, whether it's the suffering of the people or whether it's the magnitude of the complexity of the conflict. I would even say that if there was any interest, it was somewhat artificially created. On the one hand, it would probably be going back Armenian diaspora, making it a priority in some circles, or Azerbaijan working with different companies, organizations to bring its interest in or its position, whether it's media or otherwise. This somewhat of a media / Western political war between Armenia and Azerbaijan has been going on as well, pushing for their priorities, pushing for their position on the issue. If we are going to talk about some Christian groups, and I agree that I fully agree that this is not a religious conflict, and it has never been a religious conflict. And I think both parties have been trying to make sure that it is not a religious conflict. And if some groups have been trying to manipulate putting the religious context into it, they had their own interests rather than the interest of those. But if we're going to talk about any kind of supremacist groups, similarly, pretty much any statement or any document coming out of, let's say, Organization of Islamic Conference or any else has been supporting Azerbaijan, and it hasn't been because it was again a religious conflict. It was just their own interest in making sure that they're inclusive. What changed in this regard is probably the war of 2020, when again different groups tried to make it religious, and I think in general Armenians and Azerbaijanis, at least on the level of public, have been trying to avoid that. There are some groups who have still probably thought and think that this is the way to move forward. However, I hope that the religious segment will be missing from this conflict in the future as well. I don't think that's the case. Now, getting back to the perceptions in the West again, I don't think there is really not much happening in caring about what's happening on the Nagorno-Karabakh front, especially taking into account how busy the world is with Ukraine, how busy the world is with Gaza, how busy the world is with many other hotspots in the world. And I think it should be in the interest of Armenians and Azerbaijanis to find a solution on the bilateral level even. I am in the school of thought that Armenia should be considering talking to Azerbaijanis directly without mediators. This is something that I think Baku is interested also. Some of my colleagues from Armenia are suspicious about it. There is a lot of confidence building that needs to be done before we can move forward. But as you can see, there are some signs of positive movement based on the bilateral negotiations between Armenia and Azerbaijan. So what I'm trying to say is at different times of this conflict, parties probably used or tried to involve external players, third parties as well, depending on what their interest is. Obviously for Armenia, because it had no other chance, before the exodus of the Armenians of Karabakh in September, the policy was to internationalize it to the degree possible. The fact is that probably 3 or twice at least we took it to the UN Security Council. The issue, we tried to make it an international issue rather than just a local thing. While the regional players, and I don't know, maybe our Azerbaijani colleague will talk about what he thinks Baku's position is on this, have been trying to localize it to the degree possible. In that Turkey, Russia, Iran would rather keep it within the region, while of course European Union and the United States would like to be involved and are trying to make sure that they're not left out. That is on the level of international politics. I think that's the case.
Okay, Shujaat, please, what's your vision on this?
First, I would agree with the fact that this Oriental framework of the conflict worked as a two-way street. In the West, largely hampering Azerbaijani position. That is where you have a Christian supremacy, and in the non-Western countries, particularly Muslim countries, you have Armenian voice not heard because of the other way around. So I would pretty much agree with this, that the Oriental framework is something that is rather exploitative, not coming from the Armenians and Azerbaijanis, but rather coming from the others, and for largely because of their own ends. And pretty much, perhaps you've also heard nowadays some, not nowadays precisely, but in the recent months, also this religious lens of the conflict has become a thing for U.S. presidential debates among some candidates, reframing it, at least trying to frame it as a religious conflict, where, let's say, one religious group is being persecuted by another. But again, this is something, again, coming from the others rather than by the Armenians and Azerbaijanis, even though there are still Azerbaijani and Armenian groups interested in doing this mercenary job, I would say. As for where we stand now in terms of the conflict's dynamics, I would agree with the assessment that Azerbaijan has an interest in rather what I would call in regionalization of the conflict, meaning that more regional actors involved in making an Armenian-Azerbaijani settlement. But I think this is not a binary understanding, and this is not a stable understanding of what the position of Baku looks like, because I think after 2020 war, Baku pursued two specific objectives with regards to the two distinct goals path, I would say. The first, with regards to the Nagorno-Karabakh settlement process, the key goal and objective was to de-internationalize it in a way that it is not part of somehow OSCE Minsk group talks, as well as anything that would resemble OSCE Minsk group talks, where Nagorno-Karabakh status will be negotiated within some sort of international or quasi-international format. That was the top objective. On the other hand, Baku kept a door a bit open for Nagorno-Karabakh status to be discussed within not Baku, Yerevan, and international axis, but rather between Baku and Moscow axis, because it was largely seen from the perspective that since they're Russian peacekeepers, an ultimate status would be perhaps discussed with Moscow at some point of the negotiations. But I think the invasion of Ukraine and the collapse of the Russian, let's say, military vision with regards to the Ukraine in March 2022 changed the calculus, and Azerbaijan began rapidly implementing its own vision of localizing the Nagorno-Karabakh settlement process as much as possible, so it could get a lot of concessions from Russia that is becoming more and more, let's say, restrained in influencing its outside neighborhood. To be more precise, in this case, it would be the South Caucasus. So from Nagorno-Karabakh settlement, on the Nagorno-Karabakh settlement process, the goal was de-internationalize it, and it was done by let's say, variety of measures, be it the one of rejecting the OIC Minsk group, be it the one of introducing a checkpoint on the Lachin corridor, which put an end, effectively, Armenia's role as a kin state of Nagorno-Karabakh as a secessionist entity. So that de-internationalized Nagorno-Karabakh settlement process and made it a local internal matter of Azerbaijan, which will also got confirmed by some bilateral or trilateral statements have been struck in Brussels and Washington, where Nagorno-Karabakh was largely regarded as some sort of internal matter of Azerbaijan, but with the reservation of some international visibility needed. So that goal was achieved, but with Armenian on Armenian front, diplomatic front, of course, I think goal was a bit different, rather dynamic in the nature. After the war in Ukraine, Azerbaijan was largely trying to benefit from what I would call, and what many would call, of course, forum shopping between Moscow, Brussels, and Washington, wherein Azerbaijani position was quite, let's say, fluid, in a sense that it would be, let's say, negotiated between these three platforms to get the absolute best out of the three platforms by using these and the variety of diplomatic as well as the courage of tools. In that sense, I wouldn't agree that Azerbaijan had the goal of de-internationalizing Armenian and Azerbaijan talks, because it very much benefited from what's happening between what can be dubbed as the forum shopping between Moscow, Brussels, and Washington. But after September 2023, when Azerbaijan has achieved the most strategic goal, that is restoration of its territorial integrity through coercive means, of course, we have seen interest declining on Baku's end to continue forum shopping between Moscow, Brussels, and Washington, but largely because there's nothing left, actually, to be honest, to be shopped in the three capitals. What is left, as they has already been mentioned, is about the borders, which in any case would take years to be demarcated and delineated, because this is a very lengthy process. What is left is the connectivity, which is also another that got transformed because of what's happened in Nagorno-Karabakh most recently. And what is left is the humanitarian issues, which can be solved easily and technically at any time through bilateral negotiations. So after September 2023, we have seen Azerbaijani interest declining in multilateral talks, and rather interest increasing in putting Armenian and Azerbaijan negotiation, not only in regional, I would say also Azerbaijan a bit also skeptical of Russia's and Iran's role in this regard, more of like a bilateral format where Azerbaijan and Baku and Yerevan would talk with each other. But here, I think I personally feel and understand why there is a bit skepticism on Armenian end, because there is an acute power asymmetry between Baku and Yerevan on this end, and when you go in negotiations bilateral, you would definitely feel this asymmetry showing itself in various forms and shapes, where we have one party with having the absolute accumulated power projection at its disposal, and you have the other party which basically had nothing. So from that perspective, Armenian position is understandable when, in a sense that it is needing some sort of international backup that would balance Baku's asymmetrical power disbalance. But nevertheless, I would also see a merit of going for bilateral talks not only for the sake of bilateralism, but also doing it in a more regional format, ideal involving Georgia in one way or another. So we can also think of a new configuration on a regional format that could be somehow a shield against increased competition between the great powers, which could be called as another Cold War era, and some even would go as far as to call it as I wouldn't agree, but still some would still call it as a pre-World War III preparations. So from that perspective, I definitely see a merit of regionalizing this Armenian-Azerbaijani bilateralism, but not involving the outsiders, but rather Georgia, in a sense that it would be more of like a new meaning for the South Caucasus in general. So that would be my take on where things stand and what is the possibility of moving forward.
Okay, great, thank you. I've planned to ask you about the religious lens, but you answered already. So you both expressed your vision on this, and I could say that I absolutely agree with both of you that that is not the issue. But maybe we should talk about how foreign conflict affect this particular issue, because in the end of the 90s, in the early 2000s, all the world discussed Kosovo, and it was a kind of perception that sometimes principle of self-determination is possible to be used, and it's okay to support separatism in some cases. But now we are living inside the Ukrainian conflict, and everybody discussed this, and it seems that the principle of territorial integrity is the world consensus, and nobody could challenge it. So do you think that it is important in the meaning of this conflict of between Armenia and Azerbaijan? Does it matter at all? Thank you.
I guess I'll start. I don't think the principle of territorial integrity or any other principle is the one in the world that is used. The bigger players, the stronger players, are picking and choosing whichever they want. As you can see, Kosovo is not a case of territorial integrity, and the West, over 50 countries now recognize Kosovo. However, that conflict hasn't been resolved yet. The Serbian minority there is not feeling very happy with what they have. Similarly, in case of, for example, Abkhazia and Ossetia, seems like Russia is very much interested about their self-determination or talks about it. So it very much depends on the particular case. So I don't think it's right to say that the world finds this more important than the other. Obviously, territorial integrity is an issue that pretty much every country may have. You will not find two countries on the political map of the world which will not have this or that level of territorial issues with the neighboring country. It's just a fact. The difference is that in case of Western Europe, at least since the European Union has been around and after the World War II, issues are not resolved through wars, but rather by other solutions, whether it's Alsace-Lotharingia, whether it's Strasbourg in case of Germany and France, etc., you name it, right? Or Eritrea for that matter. Why do we have this or that position when it comes to one territory, and or why is the self-determination of people is becoming a bigger priority in one situation and territorial integrity is a priority for the other? So I would rather go case by case, and I would talk and discuss these issues depending on what we're dealing with. When it comes to other conflicts, regional and elsewhere, I do think, of course, there is a direct link and there is a direct impact of other conflicts on what happens in Nagorno-Karabakh. The Ukraine war is the most vivid example of how it impacted Nagorno-Karabakh. Russia, before invading Ukraine, was thinking that, well, he has it all now cleared. I do see the 2020 war and the new status quo that came after it, based on the November 9 agreement or announcement trilateral announcement between Armenia, Azerbaijan, and Russia, which brought the Russian peacekeepers into the region, was somewhat part of the plan that Russia was designing before the invasion of Ukraine. It wanted to have a new status quo, a new level of stability from their perspective before the invasion. And because it seemed like the plans of Moscow was the Ukraine war was going to take only a week, and they were going to be able to take over Kiev and replace the government there. It is now what, 600 somethings day of that war, as our Ukrainian colleagues like to say. Russia has become weaker because this war went dragged on, and Azerbaijan used that situation in order to kick Armenians out of Nagorno-Karabakh. In the long run, this obviously will mean that if there is no Armenians going back to Nagorno-Karabakh, then the Russian peacekeepers are not going to stay there. What is their purpose of staying if there are no Armenians? The reason why they appeared there was to be peacekeepers between Armenians and Azerbaijanis. There are no Armenians, there is no issue for the Russian peacekeepers to stay around. And it seems like because the Ukraine war kept on going, Russia was either unable or unwilling to stand by its commitments of being peacekeepers, and the reputational part of it, and I think Kirill, you've spoken about this many times, I've heard many others discussing this issue, has a clear correlation, and Azerbaijan used that situation with a weakened Russia. If you wish, and I don't want to name, but it's not an ethical or moral issue, the administration in Washington also probably to a degree has an interest in what's happening in the region, because as we can see, this Biden-Blinken administration is very much interested in further weakening Russia and kicking out of the region. And again, setting aside the ethical and moral aspects of this whole issue, the fact that there are no Armenians in Nagorno-Karabakh, as bad as traumatic and as negative as it is, will eventually trigger Russian peacekeepers getting out of Nagorno-Karabakh area as well, which I think coincides with the interests of the West. I will put another quick thing, and then we can keep continuing. I do think that the fact that what happened in Nagorno-Karabakh, where over 100,000 people were able to leave the whole territory, which is unheard of. I mean, if you think about it, I don't remember any other historic moment, well, at least in our recent history, where so many people would leave a territory at once, their own homes, so quickly and empty the whole territory. I think when it comes to Israel and Gaza, Israel would probably be interested in having the same situation in Gaza. In fact, from what I understand, the negotiations are also including a possibility for the Gazans to move to Egypt, but we're talking about 2 million people. It's a very different situation. It's a different setup, of course. But I think the fact that Azerbaijan was able to effectively kick out Armenians from Nagorno-Karabakh gives hope to those who are interested in a similar situation to maybe have something that can be the same. And Gaza could be one example of that. But I don't want to dive into that. That's not a conflict that I'm an expert in or I have been following very closely. I'm just speculating that this could be the case.
It seems as well as China maybe are the world champions in supporting territorial integrity principle and world policy. So do you think that this principle is the common sense or something common vision for now? So did it happen nowadays?
Yeah, I would agree with the assumptions that territorial integrity nowadays is much more supported than it was in the past. Before going into detail, I do see a merit in also discussing the legal differences. I mean, the philosophical, and philosophy always part of the legal discussions. Differences between these two understandings of territorial integrity and self-determination. Whereas territorial integrity is quite clear and column of international law that is enshrined in the UN Security Council, in the UN Charter, which is quite understandable and applicable for many. That is, you have a territory of the state recognized by international community, and it has to be protected, and it cannot be violated. So this is pretty much simple as 2 + 2 makes 4. Whereas self-determination is something as a concept that is coming from largely in the still it has roots going back to the 19th century of states going through the process of the creation of a nation states, and also culminated to the point when it was it was championed by the US during the World War I. But still, as a modern concept, it got shaped after the World War II as an understanding, as a, legal tool that could be used primarily for former colonies to get their independence. So just because of this legal essence of this, there is a lot of ambiguity of this principle in itself, which never answered the question of whether one part of the country can secede or not. And even in the most of the remarkable court scenarios, court cases regarding this debate of territorial integrity versus self-determination, I'm referring to the 2008 International Court of Justice advisory opinion on Kosovo. It refused to answer the question of whether declaration of independence, whether self-determination means secession from one territory or not. So it is one of the longest debates in the history of the, modern international legal landscape. So from that perspective, we see definitely ambiguity of this. And there's also something related to that in terms of how it is materialized. And if you look at the example of how many countries have seceded and got full legitimization, we can only think of one country, and that is Bangladesh. In 1971, it got secession from Pakistan. Until 1971, it was a part of Pakistan. It was a Pakistan. Then got secession from Pakistan and got full independence and full recognition by the international community. Other than that, you don't have any other example of territory getting seceded and getting international full legal legitimization recognition. So that is problematic in itself. Nevertheless, there have been waves of self-determination getting supported more than the other times. And here, particular 2 specific time periods are worth to mention. The one is the 1960s, when there was a wave of the decolonization of African and some Asian former colonies getting their independence, and that is also the time when the UN General Assembly resolution got adopted on the self-determination. And the second was perhaps 1990s, when the former, quasi-colonies or semi-colonies, namely Soviet Union and Warsaw Pact, getting dissolved along with the dissolution of Yugoslavia. You had the secession of the what we call the modern states of South Caucasus, Eastern Europe, Central Asia, and the Western Balkans. And here also you had the bloody conflicts in the Western Balkans and the South Caucasus about the minority groups trying to secede from the parent states. Of course, you have different reactions from the West and from the outside powers with the secession acts, which rightly mentioned by Arsen Kharatyan on how Kosovo and South Ossetia and Abkhazia got reacted differently by different power centers, even though the argumentation on the very secessionist level was pretty much the same, that we don't want to be part of the parent state because we have a long history of extermination and so on and so forth. So that is about the geopolitical aspect, but I think it should be also mentioned that legally there's also ambiguity in itself in this very understanding of this, whether self-determination means secession or not. And here most legal scholars would differentiate between internal and external self-determination, while internal one being kind of rewarded and legitimized often internationally, while external one is being rather condemned and rejected, especially in the wake of what's happening in Ukraine. I think this is something that supports and consolidates the position that external secessionism, external self-determination, or is something that is not welcomed as of now in the current international landscape. On the second point, whether international landscape affects the Armenian-Azerbaijan conflict, yes, definitely, because they are, even though every conflict is unique, the Armenian-Azerbaijani conflict is being operated within one single international system, and that is the international system that we know, where different conflict, especially if it is happening between the great powers, definitely having consequences and ramifications in this part of the world, depending on the conflict, of course. But with the Ukraine, I pretty much agree with the assessment that Azerbaijan has benefited greatly with the fact that Russia was less able to influence and also act proactively in the closer neighborhood, meaning to be more specific, in the South Caucasus. Whether the conflict sets a precedent for the others, yes, I would also agree that. There is, the theater and the handbook of the conflict management is something that is being copied by the others. And Armenia and Azerbaijan copied a lot from the others, and others copy a lot from Armenia and Azerbaijan. You have let's say an Israeli-Palestinian conflict is something that is offering, unfortunately, a lot of vicious and coercive, inhumane tactics for the many outsiders to go and think of the tools that could be used as what some would call illiberal conflict management methods. That is when you use force or coercion to achieve your conflicting goals. Unfortunately, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is rich in terms of the variety and availability of these tools and mechanisms. Indeed, Armenia and Azerbaijan copied a lot from Israel and Palestinians to a degree, and they're also copying from the Armenians and Azerbaijanis in terms of how conflict management should be adjusted according to their own goals. So I would stop here and yeah.
Okay, let's turn to political freedom factor. So some people believe that, for example, Western powers support Armenia because it's a competitive democracy, and maybe Russia or Eastern Asian countries support Azerbaijan because it is autocracy, which is more understandable for Russia or China, etc. So do you believe that it matters? Because sometime, as we could see, Azerbaijan was quite backed by European Union, and Baku. It seems that they chose European format of negotiations, and there was clearly some kind of maybe chemistry between Baku and Charles Michel, maybe. What do you believe? Thank you.
Well, unfortunately, democracy, as much as it is the choice of the Armenian people, and I'm very happy about it. I've been a pro-democracy activist and worked on this for a number of years together with friends and colleagues in Armenia, and I believe that that's the future of Armenia, and I think that in the long run, that is the future for the region as well. I think that the fact that the regimes in the countries are different, it may have benefited them more, and democracies have been losing. I remember that we were discussing it in various Western forums, saying this is a democracy under attack, and this wouldn't resonate much with even some of the Western audiences. I'm not going to go into the legalistic aspects of this issue. Obviously, the world has shown and has seen Nagorno-Karabakh as part of Azerbaijan, and in a way has approved that Azerbaijan did have a casus belli for the war, and that has been reflected in the attitudes of many different capitals. I also don't want to go back to the discussion of territorial integrity and self-determination, because it will take us back all the way back to the Westphalian Agreement of nation state, and that's a whole different discussion. But I think there were some very good examples of how countries that have become independent or proclaimed their self-determination. Bangladesh was a good example, I think, and I do think that the difference and the specificity of Bangladesh is that it was able to do it without a bloody conflict, and it still stands, and it does have the international recognition. Other than that, it is very much of a general ambiguity on wherever we have cases of self-determination and partial recognition or even a full recognition, how stable those are and how did those decisions impact the long-term conflict resolution and peaceful coexistence between nations and countries. Now, in general, I have been bringing this example, and I think this is the case. In the former Soviet space, any country that aspires democracy is punished, and that punishment is usually territorial. Be it Georgia, be it Moldova, be it Ukraine, or now Armenia. Call it democracy, call it Western integration, call it freedom of speech, call it fundamental freedoms of people. There is now it's a textbook example that the price is that you're going to lose. And I'm not only talking about Nagorno-Karabakh in this case, I'm also talking about territories which now are taken by Azerbaijani forces from Armenian territories proper. As I will agree also that the process of delimitation and demarcation or the borders will take a long time, but I don't think that it is a smart thing to keep this conflict with this new status quo to become another frozen or whatever issue in the long run. I think the regimes in the countries may matter when it comes to bilateral relations between those countries with the others, but when it comes to the regional architecture, security architecture, it is not necessarily a big deal. Yes, you will hear different statements from different institutions, be it European Parliament, be it international other bodies, that, okay, Armenia is a democracy and we need to support it, but it doesn't go beyond statements as we have seen. And in reality, the autocracies often are more effective in what they do on the ground. However, the whole situation in Ukraine is proving to be a little bit different. We'll see what happens there to be able to talk about other examples.
Okay, Shujaat, what do you think in this case?
Well, I think there has been an attempt, partially in Armenia, to a degree in the West. I mean, not necessarily governments for sure, but I mean, certain advocacy groups definitely are trying to put this lens also to the conflict between Armenia and Azerbaijan, especially until 2020 that there is a rivalry between democracy and autocracy, which I believe yet another very binary understanding of this conflict, along with the religious frame, along with the frame of ethnic ancient hatreds and so on and so forth. So this conflict is not about Russia versus West. It's not about democracy versus autocracy. It's about Islam with the Christianity. Even though if you go into deeper, you could always find elements of those lenses being a real thing rather than being something fictionary. But I would still disagree. I mean, not with you personally, but still there have been some attempts and there have been some advocacy groups arguing that this is democracy versus autocracy conflict, which I do not share and I do not agree at all. This is an ethno-territorial conflict which dates back to the late Soviet period when both countries were under the Soviet Union and they are fighting over very complex understanding of a territory combined with some ethnic identities linked to this territory and also legitimization of this territory in the eyes of whom and whose. So this is more of a complex conflict rather than a very binary understanding of the democracy versus autocracy. With regards to the whether Armenia is being supported by the West, I still would question this argument because yes, we have seen an increased rhetorical support to Armenia, especially in the past 1 year and so, especially after Armenian territorial integrity was challenged after September 2022. We've seen an increased rhetorical support to Armenia coming from some European countries, in that case specifically France, and they have US on some legislative level supporting Armenia. But the thing is, whether this support is something that could be considered as a Western backing of Armenia. I wouldn't really describe it in that way, because yes, when it comes to Armenia's territorial integrity, yes, perhaps there is a Western consensus that Armenia should not be invaded or occupied. But the thing is, the Nagorno-Karabakh conflict is not about Armenia's territorial integrity. It is about the completely other territory, which is legally located inside of Azerbaijan. We haven't seen tangible Western actions when it comes to supporting, let's say, quote-unquote, Armenian position over Nagorno-Karabakh conflict, which doesn't necessarily mean that there has been some sort of tangible action supporting Azerbaijani position, but nevertheless, I think more of like there was an ambiguity towards the region in general, the Nagorno-Karabakh conflict specifically, and with regards to which side support, it was more of like a rather letting these two parties fight, and also seeing how the things change in the ground and adjust afterwards. Of course, some countries are exception in this regard. And also, it doesn't mean that Azerbaijan, there is a, as you call, Russian or Chinese or non-Western support of Azerbaijan. Yes, there are still, and there will be probably tacit alliances between Baku and Moscow, Baku and Tehran, on multiple fronts, on multiple, let's say, subjects. But it doesn't necessarily mean Azerbaijan inherently is a pro-Russian or pro-Iranian country. On the other hand, it is quite antagonistic towards Iran, Tehran, and Moscow on different fronts, because the very meaning of Azerbaijan is something anti-Russian and anti-Iranian at the same time, and it largely benefits from this, and the unique position of being situated in between of these two anti-Western countries, and also exploiting these as much as possible when it comes to energy, transport, and other connectivity deals with the Western countries. So from that perspective, Azerbaijan is not the pro-Russian or anti-Western country. On the other hand, you can always find a lot of theaters wherein Azerbaijani and Western interests overlapped, and very the recent one, I think, even though it would be a bit conspiracy theory, a bit cynical one, still I would agree with Arsen Kharatyan that we can see also hypothetically Washington overlapping with the Baku when it comes to fate of Nagorno-Karabakh and its, let's say, impact on Russian influence and the presence in the region. So from that perspective, I really would disagree with this binary understanding of the conflict, whether Armenia is supported by the West. Actually, it is not, even though there is some increased rhetorical support. Yes, I agree, but in terms of tangible security arrangement, it is not. Or whether Azerbaijan is anti-Western country, it is not. It is really economically, geostrategically, and energy-wise, it's quite pro-Western.
Okay, thank you. Concluding our analysis of different factors, let's think about the possibility and sensitivity of their foreign public opinion to the military solutions of the conflict itself. So it seems to me that in September, when the mass exodus started, Baku speakers talked that why Western society was so deaf and so indifferent to the tragedy of our nation in the 90s, and now everybody so much care about this Armenians people. So what if the entire world does not accept the military solution at all anymore? So is it possible that maybe today in the 20s of 21st century, it is not possible anymore as it was in 20th century. So maybe I'm too romantic thinking this, but I think that it's possible option that world is so much sensitive to someone else, Spain, that military solution is not the option. Thank you.
Well, unfortunately, as we all know, in the current day media world, whether it's social media or anything else, any news does not have a life of more than 48 hours. People, little by little, get used to things and start following wars like an action movie. And I'm sorry to say this, but that's the case. And as much as you try, if the parties are trying to make it a big deal, I mean, I'm in the U.S., for example, we are seeing protests at Times Square every single day, pro-Palestinian protests. Israelis are trying to do protests in Washington, D.C. I don't know, states that have predominantly large Arab population are trying to stand up and make some points, but it only has a very short life. At the very beginning of the Ukraine invasion, I would see a lot of solidarity in the liberal states in America, where people would put up Ukrainian flags, they would have stickers, standing with the troops, etc. It's all gone now. So the solidarity or empathy of people, unless it's actually about themselves, has a very short life. People get exhausted from negative news and sort of try to, as a self-defense mechanism, try to diverge it with other type of news, whether it's watching Netflix or other things. And I mean it, actually. This is the brave new world in that respect, where especially in the post-COVID period, where people are happy to stay at home and do things on their own, and they can choose what kind of information to expose themselves to if they're not in a war-torn area. So, and that is very carefully calculated by different leaders. And if we go back to the 2020 war, the timing was very, very carefully calculated by Aliyev for the attack. It was elections in the US, it was COVID, it was a lot of the regional and other actors busy with other things. And so that's what happened. Similarly, I unfortunately don't see much of a peaceful solution coming in different fronts just because of the morality or the goodwill of people to solve issues. I think depending on the situation, everybody is taking advantage of changes in the world, and Karabakh, the results of what happened in Nagorno-Karabakh are setting yet another example of yes, the military solution is possible. And as I was mentioning, many in the Middle East and elsewhere are going to take this as an example of solving the issues. So unfortunately, in the larger scheme of events, I don't think that the outcome of what happened in Nagorno-Karabakh is going to be a good example of peaceful resolution in the world.
Okay, Shujaat, please. That's a very interesting and important issue for me. So do you believe that world is sensitive to military solutions or not? Nobody cares.
Well, I would agree with an argument that if things don't have a life of if things have life more than 48 hours, then it is nothing for the general public opinion. And neither Armenia nor Azerbaijan is capable of having this monstrous amount of financial and institutional capacity of keeping things on the agenda of the many Western audiences. It really requires a monstrous, I would say, gigantus institutional effort to keep things on the agenda, which Ukrainians are also failing to do. And we've seen how the narratives are changing in the past month and so with regards to how future should look like between Russia and Ukraine, especially changing against Ukrainians, not in favor of, for surely. So it is definitely quite a challenge, I would say, quite unachievable challenge for many to keep their right or their advocacy campaigns on the agenda of the other outside audiences. And in that case, we've seen how Armenian-Azerbaijani conflict, and especially the escalations that happened in the past 3 years, have largely ignored. And even though there were some reactions, they were reactionary, they were temporary, and they were episodic, lasted not more than 10 days. And we all remember how the attention largely shifted from Nagorno-Karabakh and the mass exodus to Gaza just in a couple of few days, because the exodus just finished around, let's say, 5th of October, and on 7th of October, Hamas attack happened against Israeli, the festival area, and largely every single, let's say, comment or article or magazine or journalist, I mean the Western, of course, with Armenia and Azerbaijan, talking about Nagorno-Karabakh, like, went off the radar and shifted their focus to the much more quote-unquote important issue for especially Western audiences, especially for the US. So that is something that is a destiny that we cannot cope with. Arsen Kharatyan mentioned a point that in 2020 calculation was made to make things in a period when there was a pandemic, when there was US elections, which I do understand. I do see the sense behind an argument, but the rhetorical question that I asked myself is that whether the reaction would have been different if things happened in 2019. That is, imagine in 2019 September war happening between Armenia and Azerbaijan, then whether the reaction would have been different. Personally, I would answer no, but again, this is something open to the debate. I'm not sure this is something rhetorical question that we cannot think of. What is the mind of the dead ones? What is the mind of the ones that were in 2019? So from that perspective, what we see nowadays is there has always been a debate of whether might is right or right is might. In the 90s, we had this liberal assumption of at least right is becoming might because of the US-based unipolar liberal order based on the international recognized rules and norms. Especially in the a decade, I would say, we have seen that no, the reverse reality is what we have now. That is, might is right, and we have seen this reality getting tested over and over, not only in Caucasus but also in Middle East, in Eastern Europe, and perhaps in the future in other parts of the world. There are hotspots like the Balkans, Sahel, and the Far East.
Okay, and so do you think that the Karabakh conflict and how it end up could be used as an example for someone else? For as I know, before it happened, Azerbaijan as well as Ukraine, so they just researched the Croatian experience of storm operation in the 90s. So do you think that what Azerbaijan did could serve as example for Moldova, for example, or Georgia, or somewhere else in the world? So do you think that could be possible for some place?
Well, it's as I was mentioning before, I think we have to go case by case, and I think it's a very particular situation with Karabakh. Those who have been following the Nagorno-Karabakh conflict over the years know that it's very difficult to compare it with any other former Soviet country or conflict. And that's not just because it's non-religious. I do believe with Shujaat that it is an ethno-territorial conflict. It was an ethno-territorial conflict. It does have to deal with identity also. There's a lot of layers in that conflict. It's not just about territory. It's not just about ethnicity, but also about this bilateral relations between Armenians and Azerbaijanis and other players having involvement in it and sort of directing or creating collective mindset. But I think one thing, if we have to compare it to any former Soviet country, in case of Nagorno-Karabakh, and I mean, tentatively we can say similar conflicts are Abkhazia, Ossetia, and Transnistria, right? And now Ukraine, of course. Nagorno-Karabakh is the case where Russia is not directly involved as a conflict party. That's the only conflict in former Soviet space where it's not Russia versus someone. In case of Transnistria, it's Russia. In case of Abkhazia and Ossetia, it's Russia. In case of Ukraine, it's Russia. In this case, Russia is a third party, as much as it's involved, but it's between Armenians and Azerbaijanis. And I think in this respect, we have to be very careful when we compare these conflicts also from this perspective. So, yes, the answer is yes, this can be an example for others, but not a good example. I think we have gone to a deeper stalemate in the long run between Armenians and Azerbaijanis, and I'm very concerned about it, because I think we're going to continue producing generations of not liking each other, to say the least. I don't want to use the word hatred, but it's true. I think we're going to deepen it. I think that it's going to create more and more, unless miraculously there is some kind of a solution in the next, I don't know, months or years, which unfortunately I don't see yet. But what I do see as a possibility or an opportunity is for Armenians and Azerbaijanis in different places to start impacting and creating a new opinion about each other. I think that's where we could possibly have some kind of a positive sign coming. Other than that, I think, yes, Nagorno-Karabakh can be an example, but unfortunately not a positive one.
Shujaat, please.
Yes, as I told you in the beginning, yes, I do believe that as a pattern-wise, it is still learned. It is being learned. It will be learned in the future how not only Azerbaijan but also Armenia acted in the past 30 plus years, and also Azerbaijan acted particularly in 2020 war and other the late front military offensives that it conducted. So pattern-wise, yes, obviously we have seen some countries at least trying to research only the military dynamics of the 2020 war, namely Ukraine, Ethiopia, Morocco, with regards to how UAVs could be applied against the hardware. But this is the one aspect. In terms of the conflict management, a lot Armenia and Azerbaijan learned from the others, and a lot from others will learn from Armenia and Azerbaijan. So from that perspective, it is not something that is unprecedented or unheard of, but rather had always been there. The others keep learning some things from the others, and Armenia and Azerbaijan are no exception in this regard. So from that perspective, yes, how Nagorno-Karabakh conflict has been, I wouldn't use the word resolved, but kind of has been a bit settled, quote unquote, through illiberal conflict management tactics, is a very quote unquote good handbook that could be used by many in the future.
Okay, dear colleagues, my last question to complete it will be about some kind of perspective. Let's suppose what kind of final resolution of the conflict will be welcomed by public opinion, foreign public opinion, best of all, and which one may be unacceptable in any case. Do you believe that there is some kind of very much welcomed and some kind of resolution which is unacceptable? Please.
I think the wounds are still fresh in many ways, especially when it comes to the people of Nagorno-Karabakh who left their homes. Obviously, after the 9 months of the blockade and everything else, they came at a very, very difficult situation, and it was a big shock. People are now little by little coming back and are trying to realize the magnitude of what happened. Obviously, as Shujaat was mentioning, this is not, many Azerbaijanis in the 90s had a similar experience. So I'm mentioning this is because this is new, and it's now Armenians who are ending up in that situation. But the difference is also in the late 80s and early 90s, both Armenians and Azerbaijanis had that. My mother's family came from Shamkhor in 1988. They were born and raised in Azerbaijan. But over 300,000 people came from Baku, Sumgait, Gyoabad, and other towns. And of course, hundreds of thousands of Azerbaijanis lost their homes in Armenia proper and in and around Nagorno-Karabakh. So I don't want to go into that direction, but I'm saying that right now, as a result of this conflict, as the last war, it's now only the Armenians who lost their homes, and that will ultimately create or impact the public perceptions in the coming months or years. Now, I think at this point, Armenians do not imagine, and I mean Nagorno-Karabakh Armenians in this case, do not imagine going back and living under Azerbaijani rule, at least where we are at this point. Maybe in the perspective it could become possible, but it can only become possible, I think, if there is a true process of, and no third party can now come and say, you know, I will secure your existence. And we saw Russian peacekeepers being there. It didn't make any difference. Whether it's Russians or other peacekeepers, it's not going to make a big difference either. So I think the possibility of cohabitation and living together can and will only be possible if there is a true confidence-building process between Armenians and Azerbaijanis, and the trust is restored on a different level. Yes, third parties can be helpful in this, but I think it's much more of a bilateral process. And I think that is, if we want to have anything close to some kind of a peaceful coexistence in this region, that is the area where we have to start working, stop maximalism to the degree possible, and discuss ways where we can actually find better type of communication and coexistence. Different societies have gone through this. We're nothing new in the world. The French and the Germans hated each other for centuries. They are now living together, as you see, peacefully and cooperating. So I don't think Armenian and Azerbaijani societies are so much more different from many others in the world. And I think that if there is a true interest and willingness to find solutions of living together in a more peaceful manner, I think it is possible, but it's very early to talk about it, especially considering the amount of the maximalist rhetoric that we're hearing.
I think you're...
Shujaat, yeah, to your turn, please.
In terms of the future path, so to say, I think the central question is whether we should envision intrastate reconciliation, that meaning Nagorno-Karabakh Armenians coming back and becoming part of Azerbaijani society and reconciling between Azerbaijanis, reconciliation between Azerbaijanis and the Karabakhi Armenians, or interstate reconciliation, meaning Armenia and Azerbaijan reconcile with each other as two distinct countries on this international map, with effectively doing a population exchange, which is euphemism for ethnic cleansing, so to say. That is, now there are no Azerbaijanis left in Armenia, all of them have been forced, and now there are no Azerbaijanis left in Armenia and no Armenians left in Azerbaijan. Pretty much akin to a scenario that would look like similar to Greece and Turkey after the World War I, when both sides, at that time it was agreed upon. In the case of Azerbaijan, Armenia, it is not. It is something that happened through the two wars, various escalations and skirmishes and the other events. But these are, I think, the two fundamental questions which I don't have any answer to either one of them. That is, either there is an interstate reconciliation, that is, Armenians return to Azerbaijan, become part of Azerbaijani society and reconcile within the one country, and also Azerbaijanis go back to Armenia and also reconcile with the Armenian state and live within Armenia as an Armenian citizens. Or we talk about coexistence in the sense that these two countries coexist side by side and reconcile with each other as two independent states, getting effectively, quote unquote, rid of the other minority, that is Armenia without Azerbaijanis, Azerbaijan without Armenians. With regards to, looking at the Nagorno-Karabakh Armenians and the political realm that was there for the 30+ years, it now seems quite unlikely to expect many of them return, because most of the things that they would feel safe enough to live in Azerbaijan are not there. That there are no international guarantees, and there's also very valid, also rhetorical question of whether this would make any difference. And there is no possibility of ethno-territorial autonomy, and there is no possibility of having some sort of international arrangement. With this in mind, we should not expect Nagorno-Karabakh Armenians returning in mass back to their homes, Azerbaijan. So from that perspective, a realpolitik solution is looking much more like an interstate reconciliation, wherein you have Armenia and Azerbaijan agreeing on some sort of formalized rules, which could be called a peace agreement, or could be called a series of agreement, or could be also no agreement, but still agreeing on some sort of formalized rules between these two states that would open some sort of a space for Armenians and Azerbaijanis from these two countries engage and also build neighborhood relations. That is something looking like more of like a realpolitik scenario where Armenia and Azerbaijan do not kill each other and open up space for talking bilaterally between the peoples and between the states. Whereas there's also a possibility of having interested reconciliation in Armenia and Azerbaijan, which is, as of now, looks like a bit unlikely for the reasons that you all know better than I do. So that would be my take on how the future looks like for these two countries.
Okay, Alex, thanks a lot, both of you. I really enjoyed this conversation. I believe that our viewers did as well. So it was really impactful, really fruitful, and sometimes sensitive. But anyway, it was marvelous.